This session is beginner track session 1 called the Fundamentals. Our speaker today is Josh Cullis. Josh is the Technical Services Manager and Knowledge Aware Consultant at Oros Knowledge Systems. During Josh's presentation, please keep the chat open and feel free to write in any comments or questions you may have, and we will have some time at the end for Q&A. Thank you all for attending, and without further ado, I'll turn it over to Josh.
Thank you, Jim. Let me share my screen here and we'll pull the presentation up. All right, I think everyone should be able to see the screen. Like Jim said, we are on the beginner track and this is the fundamentals. So we're going to spend some time talking about the basic technologies that make up this knowledge aware approach and the Oros IQ software. We'll go through those. How do you identify certain things, so on and so forth. But to kind of kick it off, we'll go through our learning points. The learning points, the first one is going to be, how do we identify our assessments? So assessments are one of the fundamental technologies in the software, like Jeff Moffa kind of talked about in his introduction. And a lot of times we'll go to organizations and it's difficult to identify where do those assessments belong within a process, or where can I use an assessment to provide value? So we'll talk a little bit about how you can identify where the assessments belong. Once we do that, we'll then give some examples, some use cases of what they actually look like. Put some visuals behind the different way that we can identify where they can provide value. Then once we've talked about assessments themselves, we'll then start to dig into, once I know where those assessments are, how do we actually identify the knowledge packets that would participate in them or make them up? We'll go through some examples of those as well, see what they look like, just kind of continuing on the use cases that we go through for the assessment exercise. So to start off, if we go through the fundamentals and we talk about identifying assessments, we have 4 main ways that we kind of gear towards identifying these assessments. We'll guide individuals or users using 4 different concepts. The first one is going to be anywhere where the omission of knowledge is painful. So that statement's kind of a mouthful, but essentially we can identify areas where if you were to not take something into consideration, it would be painful, or it could be painful by the existence of a checklist. So we kind of put checklists next to this one. A lot of times we'll go to organizations. We have these scenarios within our own organization where we use checklists to make sure that we didn't miss certain items, or make sure that we are applying certain pieces of knowledge. So that's one good way to identify where an assessment control can provide some value. The second one is going to be the need for traceability and or audit. So what we mean when we say this is things like ISO certifications. You may have CQI certifications, and essentially in order to get certified by those different organizations, they're going to come in, they're going to want to see traceability for how decisions were made, or how you're complying to standards. They're going to perform audits for those types of things. When those scenarios present themselves, a lot of time the assessment can be the evidence that will pass the audit. We have a lot of organizations that start to implement different processes within the software. And then when their auditors come in, they simply pull up assessments, and the full trail of decision-making and evidence that was provided for different requirements is all going to be available because of the use of an assessment control. And then the next 2 items that we'll talk about are similar, but the way that Oros handles them is a little bit different. And we'll get into the examples as we go through the process, or through the presentation. But it's standard process and or standard work. So a lot of times we go into situations where, every time you're going to file a certain ticket, there are 10 or 15 different things that you have to do. Or every time you're going to manage a project, there are certain activities within the process for managing that project, and they're standardized. So if you have items where you have standard process, you have standard work, that's another area where Oros assessments can provide a lot of value, and applying this knowledge aware technique can start to provide some efficiencies and start to create that continuous closed loop learning that we've talked about earlier today, and then that we'll talk about here over the next couple of days. So if we take those 4 principles and we kind of talk a little bit about what do assessments look like, we'll start with our first use case. The first use case is a checklist. So we have a couple different organizations that do something very similar to this. We chose a pretty standard name for this particular process, but it's called Workstation Readiness. And essentially what happens is you have different stations within the plant, a manufacturing plant, and before that line or before the plant gets up and running, we have, auditors or quality control individuals that will go through the plant, and they want to ensure that each workstation is ready for when the plant goes live or when manufacturing starts. So in the past, we had a lot of groups that had different checklists associated with this kind of thing. We've taken that checklist, or the groups have taken those checklists, and they've turned them into OROS assessments. And the visualization of what that looks like is very similar to the checklist. There are a few different things that visually are going to be different, but in general, we have a list of items that need to be completed. We have our conformance palette on the left-hand side. So this is the pass, fail, not applicable type of thing. We have a lot of organizations that will do complete, not complete. The actual software itself is very flexible, so you can customize what this conformance palette or these conformance states look like. But essentially, the checklist is going to come into OROS, and a lot of the knowledge-aware things that we saw Jeff talk about in the presentation earlier will now be capable. But from an end-user perspective, it's very similar to filling out the checklist that you might fill out today in Excel from an end-user experience perspective. So if we go now to the second use case, the second one was the traceability and audit. So where there's this need for decision makers coming together, making decisions, and then being able to have traceability or being able to pass audits based on those decisions or the things that were done. Here, the example that we have is actually a design review. So there are a lot of different pieces of information. Jeff kind of touched a little bit on this earlier on. You might have design for manufacturing standards. You may have product development standards. There's all sorts of things that could come into a design review, and we need to make sure that our designs are adhering to those things, or if we're not, we're at least making decisions and documenting why we don't adhere, why we're going to go around a certain best practice or requirement, whatever it might be. So one thing that we'll notice here when we look at this particular assessment is it looks very similar to the checklist. So what OROS is going to try to do in a lot of different areas is we want to make the effort that's required from end users to come in and evaluate information or come in and apply knowledge. We want the effort to understand it and to consume it to be reduced. So where a lot of times Excel files or PDFs or Word documents or PowerPoints, they give you the freedom to kind of customize the visualization. We want the content to be customized. We want the evaluation process to be customized, but we want the visual user experience to be consistent from one area to the next. So even though the first use case was evaluating the readiness of a workstation, the second use case is conducting a design review, the visualization of the knowledge packets is very similar, or the visualization, of the assessment is very similar. We'll get into the knowledge packets in a little bit. But that visualization of where the pass-fail condition can be visualized, the actual item that's being reviewed, text. In this particular assessment, we have multimedia images. So those are then depicted here on the right as we continue to go left to right. But the main idea is that the visualization from one use case to the next, we want to be as consistent as possible. So in traceability and audit, and then if we talk a little bit about the workstation readiness checklist that we just went through, visually, they're going to look very similar. So the third use case, we actually chose one of the processes that we employ within our organization at OROS Knowledge Systems, and that is the act of managing a seed project. So if you're not familiar with the term seed project, it's essentially the way that we onboard workflows. So we go out, and we'll actually talk about that in the next breakout session on the beginner track, but we actually go out, we start to learn about processes, we educate organizations on the knowledge-aware concept and the way that it can be employed. And then we'll actually manage the project using OROS, using standard process. And there are various different activities that we'll go through. There should be some linear execution to them. And essentially, we depict that here in the knowledge packet, and the assessment is going to track our progress. So we'll have things like timing flags. You can see that these milestones were met on time. And we're actually going to go into the next use case, which is standard work, which is part of this standard process example that we use here. So with our seed project, we have multiple activities. They happen in a linear fashion. And we're going to use an assessment to kind of track how those are adhering to the process, if we're on time, if we're not on time, if there are items that we need to address, if we have any reds or greens or risks that are introduced to the project. We're going to manage those through an oral assessment. And this one visually, as you can see, is a little bit different, maybe a lot different from what we were just looking at. But that's because the application and the visualization of process is very different from, a list of items that need to be adhered to, so on and so forth. This particular process has that linear execution, which we find the method do a really good job of when we're tracking them in an assessment control. So if we then go to the fourth use case, it's the standard work. So again, it's very similar to standard process where there are certain things that need to happen every time you're applying a concept or a process, whatever it may be. But here we might have an activity within our process, and that's made up of 6 different standard work items. So this is actually an assessment embedded into an assessment. We have one that's a parent and one that's a child. The parent is the process. The child is the standard work at each step within said process. And what that standard work assessment looks like is very similar to what we've seen already with the checklist, and it's very similar to what we saw with the design review. So there's a collection of standard work. We need to make sure that that standard work is complete. We have evidence and information that's captured as we go through the process of completing that standard work. But from a visual perspective to the end user, there's a lot of consistency between the fourth use case, the second use case, and the first use case. Our third one, is a little bit different, but that's because we're depicting the process, we're depicting sequence, those kinds of things. And then here in the standard work use case, obviously, and then the other 2 that we went over in the beginning, the visualization is going to be consistent, as consistent as we can make it. So once we've identified our assessment controls, and we talked about the 4 different ways, the omission of knowledge being painful, the standard process, the standard work, and then the need for traceability and audit. Once we've identified that this is where our assessment would be valuable, how do we start to identify the knowledge packets within those areas that we should be evaluating or should be included in our assessment controls? So we'll kind of go through each different category. The first one is the omission of knowledge is painful. So that's the checklist. This is probably the easiest one to identify what the knowledge packets are, because essentially they would be the items in the checklist. It's not always one for one. Sometimes the use of documents and the way that knowledge is managed in the traditional sense can make it so that our checklist might not be super efficient. And some of the things that the knowledge aware technique can do might make some of the checks that are in that checklist obsolete or not as important. But in general, it's pretty straightforward. If we have a checklist and there's 10 items in it, we generally see 10, 8, items in the assessment control, and the knowledge packets are just the rows that were in the checklist. If we then go to the next example or the next category, which is the need for traceability and audit, this is generally the items that have to have either the decisions that are made. So a lot of times we'll go through the design review and we're making decisions based on best practices, based on requirements, based on design for manufacturing, feasibility, those kinds of things. The items that we need to know we've made a decision on, a lot of times will be knowledge packets. And then the other things that we'll see in this particular category that create knowledge packets or lend themselves well to knowledge packets are going to be the items that you'll be audited on. So where do you need to provide evidence that certain things were done? Those items oftentimes make good knowledge packets for a couple of different reasons. One, once they're in the assessment and the evidence is provided, it's pretty straightforward to then pass the audit and bring those things up from a historical perspective. But the other aspect of this is as you need to pass audits, there a lot of times is knowledge behind how do you execute a certain activity, or how do you format evidence that needs to be provided to a certain organization. That information can be kept in the knowledge packet. So the assessment gives you the opportunity to collect all that information in the same place, put your evidence there, pass the audit moving forward. But if you have individuals that are maybe executing the process, or they're going through the actual activity for the first time, the knowledge packet provides the mechanism to, in an integrated fashion, give the background for how to execute or how to complete certain tasks or certain activities. So generally, the items where you need to provide evidence, or the items that need to be completed and the organization is going to come back and audit would generally be the knowledge packets in the traceability and audit example or category. And then as we go into standard process, standard work, these ones are very similar. For standard process, it's generally the steps within the process. You can, a lot of times, and what we'll see organizations do is you may have multiple different phases within your process. And when you put all those things together, you might get a lot of steps. So sometimes we'll see organizations break each phase into its own knowledge packet, and then the steps within that phase are depicted in the method. We do have other groups, though, and there are certain workflows that we have internally where the entire process is one knowledge packet, and the steps within it are just the steps that are depicted on that canvas, similar to what we showed earlier. And then the standard work in a very similar fashion, just the items that make up the standard work. So we kind of went through the example that we'll talk about here is actually a peer review. So when we're going through the execution of a seed project or of onboarding a new workflow, we want to manage the risk and we want to assess the risk at certain points in time. So we do peer reviews throughout that process, and there are certain risk categories that we want to evaluate as a standard element of work throughout that process. So for us, our standard work are the risk categories, and then those risk categories get turned into knowledge packets. So now that we've talked a little bit about how do you identify the knowledge packets within the assessment, we'll take a look at what some of those might look like. So we've gone back to our first use case, which is the checklist or this workstation readiness. And in a similar fashion to where we want the assessments to visually be consistent from one use case to the next, we want to remove all the noise. We want to make it easier for end users to engage with the knowledge, for them to evaluate the knowledge, and any formatting or anything that may take away from just the simple application of the knowledge is something that we want to see if we can remove. So similar to the way that we do that with the assessment control, we also want to do that with the knowledge packet. So if we open up one of these items that's in the Workstation Ready checklist, it's pretty straightforward. This is making sure that within the workstation are the safety signs posted. If you're a new user or maybe a new individual that's going through and trying to understand how to conduct this workstation readiness check, the knowledge packet gives us the ability to kind of give a description for what that means. We've got a bulleted list here that says where they need to be, how they're going to be oriented to the workstation. And then in addition to that, we have the ability to take multimedia and kind of put a visual of what a properly posted safety sign would look like. So the knowledge packet here, pretty straightforward. In a lot of ways, it looks very similar to a document or a PDF. But as we've talked about this continuous closed loop learning and kind of being able to use artificial intelligence to provide insights back, the knowledge packet behind the scenes is doing a lot of things that a Word document or a PDF just isn't going to be capable of doing. But we still have the visualization that's very similar to what people are used to. So if we now go on to our second use case, and we'll talk about the traceability and audit, essentially what we have here is an assessment control that looks similar to what we just saw. And if we open up one of these requirements, we're going to see that this knowledge packet has to do with the desired engagement of a console locator pin to the hinge. So we're trying to see, is the locator pin going through enough but not too much? So it's not anything that's similar to, is a safety sign posted? It's very different from a contextual perspective, but the visualization is consistent. So we have the title of the information up at the top, similar to the safety sign, some background information here. There might be more text, but still the text is located in the same place. Here we also have a visual. So this visual is, instead of a sign in a plant, it's an actual CAD drawing with a highlight around what the engagement is. But from a visual perspective and the orientation or the organization of the information, it's consistent from one use case to the next. We actually have, and we'll talk a little bit about this in the next presentation or the next breakout session, this knowledge model down here that we call a value table. So that's going to be located just below the multimedia. Sometimes these things are here, sometimes they're not. But what we're starting to see here is the consistency of the assessment control, the consistency visually of the knowledge packet, and we're starting to remove all the noise that end users have to sift through when they're trying to apply and evaluate their knowledge. So if we go to our third use case, standard process, again, this is the one that from a visual perspective is different, but there are reasons for that, and it's the sequential nature, the process control that we've talked a little bit about. This one is going to be very similar to what we see in the assessment with a couple differences. So in the assessment control, you can see kind of where we've gone through the process. There's obviously standard work that's indicated by these icons here. And as the process is executed, we have like the greens, and if we were to be late on a milestone or something like that, these greens would potentially be red. So essentially, the visualization in the assessment is very similar to what the knowledge packet looks like. The knowledge packet is just going to lack the greens and the reds, and it'll lack the standard work. But here we're depicting, there's a decision to be made. After that decision is made, or based on what the decision is, there's certain standard work that needs to happen. There are different activities where we need assessments to track the standard work. Again, more decisions. But the visualization of the knowledge packet, very similar to what you see in the assessment. It just lacks the actual evaluation components like the greens and the reds and the child assessments. So if we then go on to our fourth use case, we've got standard work. So here there's a depiction of the same process that we just looked at, but we actually have this child assessment with the 6 items of standard work. So we've seen this assessment before, very similar to use cases 1 and 2. And if we open up a knowledge packet for this, I talked a little bit about, we have peer reviews within our seed project process or our workflow onboarding. We want to manage the risk and we want to review it with peers to see if there's risk introduced in the project. So part of the standard work is a risk category. This is one of the risk categories associated with our onboarding. So very similar to the other knowledge packets that we saw, we have a title up across the top. There's rich text and kind of some background for information on how to apply this or how to assess the risk. And what you'll notice is there aren't multimedia images, so there's no actual image of the risk of value or anything like that. But from a visual perspective, even though there's no multimedia, it's still very similar. Our tabs are up across the top. The title is the first thing that we see. The rich text is followed by then the chapters at the bottom. So as we go across these different use cases, we're able to see consistent visualization, even though the context and the application may be very different. So I think that was all we had. Jim, I think I did okay with time. Is there any questions that we had come in?
No, you're good, Josh. We got about 3 minutes left in the session, so it's enough time for questions. I don't see any in the chat, so if anybody has any, feel free to type them in. I did have a quick one for you. I was DM'd this one. What are the typical challenges you see when getting organizations to create Kpacks?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's different with all different organizations. A lot of times customers will kind of give us a hard time because we'll get asked questions and our response in a lot of scenarios is it depends. I think this one, it does depend, but typically what we'll find is there's a reticence to embark on a knowledge aware initiative because there's so much captured data and you want to be able to use that data. I think the main aspect of, how we address that is 2 things. One, we don't want to take the existing information and just one for one turn it into knowledge packets. The reason for that is that the document-based approach and the way that knowledge has been managed traditionally has some limitations involved in it. So what we want to do is we want to take those documents, we want to look at them and understand, what information actually needs to be evaluated. Once we do that, we'll take the information out of the documents that needs to be evaluated. And we have a lot of different ways to mass create knowledge packets. So it's really, to answer the question, it's really a matter of identifying what information needs to go into the knowledge packets. And then through the seed project process, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, there are a lot of different ways that we can create it in mass. We have some groups that just choose to do it manually. Other groups, we've created thousands of knowledge packets through software scripts. We have Excel import options that allow us to create knowledge packets that way. So a lot of different ways we can create them. And it really just is a product of the needs of the group on how we actually do that.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate that. I think that's a good foundation for the beginner track, and we're looking forward to the next session. We're about out of time. I want to be respectful so everybody can refill their coffee. But if you have any questions, please know that you can reach out to Josh individually or myself as well, and I'll make sure we get your questions answered. So you all know, and again, you're going to hear this a lot throughout the course of the conference, I just posted a survey link in the chat. If you wouldn't mind taking a couple seconds to fill that out for us, we would greatly appreciate any feedback. And it's really important to us, and we do listen to what you guys say. The next session, beginner track session number 2, which is knowledge modeling, starts in about 5 minutes at 2:15, which will also be led by Josh. So we hope to see you all there. And thank you again for attending this first session. We'll see you at the next one. Appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thanks.